So, briefly, this is Warren Redlick. Welcome to the channel. Thank you for watching. I have with me Ioana, let's see, I'll point this way. Ioana Marinescu, who is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice. Did I get that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And Professor Marinescu is an economist. I am an economist wannabe. I never managed to succeed, but I tried years ago. So,
and a coffee lover too.
Okay, she's a coffee lover. Everybody. I'm a hot chocolate lover. So we're going to talk about universal basic income. I did a video a while back. I'll probably put a link to it in the description where I looked at Andrew Yang's discussion of universal basic income with Joe Rogan. This is a train wreck. Okay, so let's start with this. You and I talked about this before briefly. What problems is universal basic income designed to solve?
Right. So universal basic income, there's several reasons why this might be a good idea. And one of them that you have talked about on your channel before is the fear that jobs are going to disappear. And we can get back to that. But the traditional, in a way, a more traditional justification, this idea has been around for a long time, is in terms of how it could simplify the social welfare system. So essentially, right now we have a system that, compared to other rich countries, is both not very generous, but also has a lot of holes, in the sense that there's many different programs, and to qualify for each, there's all sorts of criteria. And so people could easily fall through the crack and find themselves with low income and not much to be supported in that situation. And so that's one. And then the other one is regarding incentives for work. There are a lot of the social protection programs we have, for example, food stamps. Once your income is high enough, you lose your food stamps completely. And that is something that's been noted for a long time. It creates what we call a poverty trap, so that people potentially are worried of taking a small job because they might lose their benefits. And then, they don't know when they're going to be able to qualify, and so on and so forth. And so this, for some, can create a disincentive to better themselves. Whereas a universal basic income, because you receive it no matter what, doesn't create that. It's also called a benefit cliff, where, if you go just above some level of income, you're going to lose your whole benefits. And that, again, can create a disincentive for people to try to make more, especially when they are uncertain about the future, and they don't know if this job's gonna last. So then they're gonna get off the benefit. When will they be able to potentially get on the benefit again? What if the job doesn't last? So these are the classic problems. So simplification, making sure nobody falls through the cracks, but also a better incentive structure where people get to keep it, and therefore there is no concern for people to have that if they make more money, they're going to be cut off benefits. So those are the more classic justifications for it. And then there's the whole tech thing, which we can also talk about if you want.
Okay. Let me just test my sound again. Could you just give me a sound check? Say 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3. Okay,
so I'm going to lower your sound. Somebody said that my sound was lower than yours, and I can see it on the computer. So let's see if that. Cool. I think that'll be better. Okay. So right. Constantly learning. So let's tear this apart. So the first, if I understand you correctly, and don't forgive me if I don't, there's two things. One is we need to provide people some basic level of income, and two is we want to avoid the demand cliff, the challenge that if we give them the wrong set of benefits, then it discourages them from working. Do I have that roughly right?
Right.
Okay, so
yes.
So let's talk about the first one. What's the right level of universal basic income? And you're, sorry, just to be clear, because some people who are involved are from Canada, other countries, and you are from another country, but you live in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, right?
That's right.
So,
Philly.
So in the United States, what is the right level of universal basic income, and does it vary by geography? In other words, is the right level for universal basic income in Mississippi? Let's start with the first question. Let's start with this question, right. The geographic question. Okay, so would it be the same universal basic income in Mississippi as it would be in Manhattan?
So in my view, yes. And that's because this gives people, well, two reasons. First of all, it gives people maximum freedom. So, if you live in an expensive area and now you can go somewhere, take your basic income that's cheaper, and you don't have to be stuck there. So you can take more risk and go to a place that potentially is going to be better for you. And then the other idea, and this is more along the lines of political economy, but I think it's important. Our, more rural, less urban regions have been left behind. And so even though it's not the main reason for a basic income, having the same basic income everywhere, de facto is helping disproportionately areas that are in decline, areas that are cheap. For them, it's a bigger help. And I think that given the context where we are at, that a lot of these areas have been left behind in terms of economic growth, that's actually probably a desirable feature to have, the basic income be the same for them, and therefore de facto be higher compared to their cost of living.
So that takes us into the next question, though. What is the appropriate level of basic income for an individual in the United States? If we're going to have it uniform across the country, what's the right number? Because I think Andrew Yang said $1,000 a month, and I think some people have been talking about $2,000 a month. Is there a right number? Is there a way of measuring what? And I'm not asking you for a simple number. I actually think there's a bigger question of, is there a sound way of measuring what that number should be, and what's the method that would make sense to use, and what number do you think if it has been done, what number has it come up with?
Right. So first of all, there is no right number as far as the economics, in a sense, because it's all about priorities or values. It's like, how much do you really value everybody having, some certain level of income? And depending on how much, politically we care about that, and different people might vary in their opinion, you might have it higher and lower. And so I don't think that there's a clear answer to that in terms of, economics tells us if we're going to have it, you should put it this much. Now, what you could consider, for example, and people have thought about that in looking at such programs, is the poverty line, for example. So, we have, and it's somewhat arbitrary as well, actually, by the way, but in the US, we have something called the poverty line, and that's used, for example, for the Obamacare to determine if you're going to get subsidies for healthcare. So if your income is below the poverty line or up to a certain times the poverty line. So that's, for example, one way to anchor it. And then you could talk about it in terms of how many times the poverty line. And you might want to say should be at the poverty line. But that's not like the end of the argument. It's just a way to try to anchor it and sort of think, well, relative to what, that might be one thing you might be wanting to look at.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the universal basic income amount is really a political determination rather than an economics determination.
Correct. Okay. Yes.
So, and I guess within that question, there's some other questions about, let me just make sure I'm not going off on my list of questions that I had. Okay, I guess another question I had along those lines are, there's the individual, right? So it's easier to think about it when you have one person who's living alone. What should this person's income be? But what about a family of four? You've got a husband and a wife and two kids, and one kid is 18 and one kid is like 15. And maybe there's a 3-year-old. So let's say we decided the number is $1,000 a month. Do they get $5,000 a month because there's 5 of them? Do kids get less? How does that apply?
Right. So, again, the simplest way would be to have everybody have the same amount and per person, including kids. And it's actually quite important to give it to kids in terms of now the effects that can have. And I just want to just briefly do a segue to point out to our listeners that when we look at the cost-benefit analysis of policies, so how much they cost the taxpayer, how much, we can get out of it, some of the best policies that have been tried in the US are those that help low-income children. So the idea of not giving it to children for that reason seems like not a great idea, unless you might want to do something else with them. But certainly that's a strong argument that kids should get it, because we know from a lot of research that this is the sort of thing that will have a lot of positive effects. So briefly, it will improve their education outcomes, their health, they're going to be making more money, paying more taxes, and less likely to use social services, which cost the taxpayer. So in that sense, it's quite important to make sure that kids get that. Another reason why you potentially don't want to adjust for family structure is in terms of a big argument for UBI that I haven't had the chance to make yet for some is the freedom aspect, right? So the fact that you get your money and you can do whatever you want with it. And it's a bit of a problem if you're going to make it different by family structure, because it's going to create specific incentives for people to be in some sort of family structures versus others, depending on how much they're getting. So this is similar, if you guys ever heard about this, to the so-called marriage penalty in taxes, that if you're married, you might come to pay more taxes, right, and that can discourage people from getting married. And again, in economics, we have this whole idea of like non-distortionary. In general, unless we have a good reason, we want to let people make their own choices. Therefore, we don't necessarily want to encourage any type of household structure. And by having it individual, well, then it doesn't matter. Whatever, if you are married or not, or whatever, who's taking the children, it's attached to the person. So the children keep receiving it no matter what.
So, but when you describe it that way, it sounded, I can read the comments, people are saying, I would adopt 25 children. What doesn't that potentially have the incentive of encouraging people to have more children, for example? Which I don't personally mind. It would lead to population growth, which some people are concerned that there's too many people on the planet and the planet is growing. So if you said, everybody gets $1,000, so now a family of 5 is getting $60,000 a year, and if I have 2 more kids, I'm getting an extra $2,000 a year.
Right.
I think that creates its own perverse incentive structure.
Potentially, but people have looked at, so what comes closest. So first of all, you have to realize, obviously, for higher income people, this whole extra income is peanuts. So it's not going to influence them. So those that it might influence are lower income people. And so the most relevant research here, certainly for the US, is research on welfare. Because welfare, as we know it, actually also depends on the number of kids. And it creates also potentially, for the same reason that you just said, the more kids you have, the more benefits. It's capped, at some point, so that it's kind of decreasing the extra amount of benefit, perhaps because people worry. But with those kinds of differences, the researchers have been able to look at that. Does it in fact influence welfare recipients to have more kids? And it doesn't. So just based on the evidence, I don't think that that's a significant practical problem, even though in theory it could happen. But practically speaking, again, based on what we know from the welfare system, that doesn't seem like a major concern. So that's, I just don't think that practically speaking, it's a serious concern.
That's really a good segue to a question I was going to ask you before the other question, which was, so for people who don't understand, the reason I specifically asked Professor Marinescu to come on the channel is because Professor Marinescu has done actual research on universal basic income or programs similar to universal basic income. So I think I saw you speaking about Alaska. I don't know if that was your research or someone else's.
Yes, it's my own research.
So could you tell the audience what research you did about Alaska, why it's relevant to universal basic income?
Yeah, so Alaska has something that's quite similar to universal basic income. So once a year, every Alaskan, and this includes children, so it's similar to the scheme we were talking about before. So every Alaskan, the only condition is you have to have lived in Alaska legally for a year. So that's basically the only condition. Then you can get this income, and it's from the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend. It's based on their oil money that they invested in a fund, and what you're getting is the basically the returns of that invested fund. So it doesn't come directly from oil money; it comes from the returns to the fund. So it's quite an interesting, by the way, way that they set it up over there. So anyway, from that, every year, every Alaskan gets. It varies with the returns, but it's roughly between $1,000 and $2,000 per person. So in a high year that it's $2,000, family of 5 are getting $10,000. So, it's not super huge, but it's still significant compared to, for example, the earned income tax credit, which is another kind of tax credit that low income people could be getting. And so what we were interested in with my co-author at the University of Chicago, Damon Jones, is to what extent this would potentially create disincentives to work. And so, we looked into that with Alaska. And we found that, by comparing Alaska with other similar states, we find that, in fact, it doesn't have any effect at all on Alaskans' propensity to have a job. And it does increase somewhat part-time work, potentially because some people are now able to get a part-time job and are able to pay for childcare. But in any case, the key headline result is that it has no effect on employment. And then we say, wait a minute, shouldn't that have some effect on employment? Because from economics, we have this basic assumption, it's called the income effect, that the richer you are, the less you want to work. And that's simply because you don't need to work as much to eat the same amount, basically, to just consume the same amount. So that's called the income effect. So therefore, if you just give people more income, you expect from basic theory that perhaps they'd be working less. And we're like, we don't find that, why not? And then we unpack that, and what we find, and it's very interesting, is that it looks like the dividend in Alaska stimulated job creation among local businesses like retail, restaurants, and so on. So therefore, even if perhaps some people wanted to work a little bit less, on the other hand, there were more jobs to go around. So we think these two effects cancel each other out, so you end up with no employment effect overall in Alaska. So that was very interesting to us to see that macro effect, because a lot of studies are very micro and look at individual behavior, but that's forgetting that something like a basic income is not just income for people, but it's potentially income that goes and gets spent, and therefore income for businesses as well, certainly the types of businesses that these people patronize.
Okay, so I'm going to try to summarize what you just said, because I read your paper. And I thought about it. So if I understand correctly, an Alaskan family of 5 gets about $10,000 a year, and the key effect that you were looking for was, does it discourage them from working?
Correct.
And so the danger in making that comparison that I see is, number one, $10,000 is not a lot of money. It's not going to cover, $10,000 a year is not going to cover rent for most people in the least large parts of the United States, especially for a family of 5. And most people would want to make more money if they were making $10,000 a year, where if you made it $1,000 a person per month, then it would be $60,000 a year, and the incentive to work would be, it would have a greater impact on the incentive to work. And I don't know how easy it is to, and maybe you can answer this. I don't know if this is, I don't know if this is an elasticity, but how does this stretch from $10,000 a year to $60,000 a year to, some people are saying $2,000 a person, so it'd be $120,000 a year. How does that stretch work out?
So there's several interesting bits to that we can know from existing evidence. So first of all, there are experiments currently run in Africa with huge amounts relative to the average income that are maybe more like 2,000 a month. And there, of course, it's cheaper to do that because you can send people some significant amount for the local income. And they don't see any employment effect, because probably the reason is like what we were saying before, these people are poor. And yes, they're getting a lot, but they still want to better themselves. And the big advantage of basic income is that you don't lose it, right? So you get it no matter what. So now you can go out and get more for yourself if you so wish. So that's one thing. But perhaps more relevant to the US is the evidence on lottery winners. So people have looked at people making a huge, first let me tell you why that's relevant here.
Let me be clear about this. Let me be clear about this. I heard you speak about this. I think it was in a video that I watched you speak.
Mm-hmm.
And the number I heard from you was they got $100,000. Was that $100,000 a year, or was it $100,000 total?
Full total.
Okay, so they get $100,000, which spread over a lifetime. I was like screaming at YouTube when I heard you say this. $100,000 spread over a lifetime is not a lot of money.
Okay, but that was just the average. It was just a way of talking about the effect. In the sample, you have people who got millions of dollars. Okay. So there's all sorts of different amounts. So this was just a summary. Like if you were getting 100,000, then you would reduce your work by this much so that people can scale it. Doesn't mean that everybody was getting 100,000. And I just want to make it clear for our listeners, why is lottery relevant? Because if you win the lottery, you get an amount of money, no strings attached. So from the individual perspective, it's like UBI. Here's some money, no matter what you do, you get to keep it. And in fact, some lotteries are in installments. So it's even more similar to having a regular income. So that's why this is relevant here, because this is money, no strings attached, that people get, those who win the lottery. So, and thanks to that, because some people win super big, we can sort of look at the more you increase and what happens to work incentives. And the answer is that as you increase the amount of money by 10%, people work about 1% less. So it's there, but there isn't, by the way, there is no bang bang effect. It's not like you reach some amount and then people drop out. That's just not happening. It's like proportional. People work less, and usually it's through a reduction in hours. So people take more vacation and so on. Most people don't quit working. So that's what you see on average with lottery winners. Now, that lottery study only looks at individual behavior. It doesn't take into account what effect it would have on businesses. And so that's an important wrinkle, because if we did that on a large scale, yes, perhaps there would be more disincentive to work, but at the same time, there would be more income thrown into the businesses, creating jobs, and potentially, and the more income you give, and the more the consumption goes up. So this other effect would also increase. So it's sort of like which one dominates, we don't know, because nobody has done like a large scale, big amount, well, except in Africa. And there the net effect is not to discourage work, but this might not apply to us. But over there in Kenya, they did it at the whole village level with large amounts, and it didn't have, on the contrary, they saw a net job creation. So more businesses, more employment. So it's quite interesting. It might not apply to the US, but I think it's the best example we have.
Question I have about the Kenyans, because I haven't seen this Kenyan research. Are they told this money will continue forever, or do they have reason to be concerned that this money is going to end?
10 years.
Okay, so they got money for 10 years. That's a pretty long stretch.
Right.
But I would think as you get closer to did they go 10 years and see what happened in the 9th and 10th year?
It just started like a couple of years ago, so we don't know yet, what's going to happen.
I think if you have a set endpoint, you're still thinking, okay, I'm going to need money after the, well, there's rational actors and there's not rational actors. And the rational actors would be thinking, okay, well, this money's going to go away in 10 years. I got to make money now, so I have it. Maybe this makes it easier for me to make money now. It's going to be harder for me to make money later. So, but we don't necessarily have a lot of rational actors in our world. That's one of the big mistakes economics sort of makes. But okay, so let me see. Okay, so I guess one of the other questions so that's a very specific question that maybe is easier to measure than some other problems that universal basic income might create. That's the question: does it discourage work? Are there, off the top of my head, nothing's coming to my mind. I have a general concern about UBI, but are there other criticisms that people have raised about universal basic income that you think have been adequately addressed by economics? And if so, can you give me an example of one or two?
Yeah. So I think the work thing is probably one of the most frequent ones, and it's worth addressing, and that's why I've been working on it. Another one is that it would make people spend on like bad stuff,
drugs.
And
they're going to buy drugs with the money.
We have a lot of evidence that that's not the case. So people spend it normally, like they spend the rest of their money, no differently basically. So there's no particular increase in spending on, I don't know, like drugs and alcohol or anything like that. In fact, in some cases, it's the opposite. So, for example, we have evidence from casino dividends. So if you look at Native Americans, they receive regular income from their casino that is also no strings attached as long as you're a member of the tribe. And for the poorest among them, it actually decreased drug and alcohol problems relative to the control group. So in general, that, again, I don't think, based on the evidence we have, I don't think that that's a significant concern either.
Okay. So thank you very much. I don't think I have a criticism for that, so I won't even try. So when you take your research into how it affects working and spending, do we have any indication as to, I think you kind of answered this with Africa, but do we have a sense of how this would apply? It's a big jump to go from, Alaskans get $1,200 a year, or $10,000, whatever. I think it's $1,200 a year. Isn't that the payment for one person? Was it 2,000?
It varies every year between 1,000 and 2,000 because it depends on the returns of the fund, and that's sort of the typical range.
Let's call it 10,000 for a family of 5.
Right.
You take that in one state that has a very specific set of circumstances, and then you say, okay, we're going to make it 6 times as much, and we're going to make it nationwide. Is there any way we can know or be confident that the same effects will take place in the same way when you expand it to a larger amount, to a larger geographic? And I think an example of that is Alaska has a different set of, let's say, demographics than the United States as a whole. Africa
Right.
has one set of demographics that's different. I don't. Is there a demographic effect? Do you see?
Right.
Let's turn to that question. Do you see demographic effects? Does universal basic income work differently in different ethnic or
So
gender or other populations?
mostly we see different effects by income, which is completely predicted by economics. So, like for high income people, this is not a lot of money, it doesn't affect their behavior. So any effect, including positive ones that I discussed, like improvements in education and health, are seen only for low income individuals. And also, if you expect significant work disincentives, that would also be the people. Because again, if you're a CEO, like who cares? You're not going to cut your hours, for a little bit of extra money in your pocket. So basically, I think so. But to your question, Alaska is just one example. There's many other cases like that, including I talked about the Native Americans, I talked about the lottery winners, I talked about experiments in Africa, and generally the findings are pretty consistent. They're not exactly identical, and for example, the work disincentive varies a little bit across settings, but it does vary between a little bit and nothing at all. I just want to point out. And then, many other results are quite consistent across different, settings. So I feel pretty confident that the results we already know are likely would hold up. What is less clear is about this whole, like, if it's really a lot of money, it's going to have macro effects. And some of it could be good, like I just said, but there's always a little bit of unknown, especially if it's a very large program. It's hard to be 100% confident about what it would do, but I do feel like a lot of the effects on individual behavior, there's been enough research in different contexts with pretty similar results that I think we have a good handle on that. And plus, right now, there's a bunch of new experiments that are being done at this very moment in the US, including one by my colleague Amy Castro-Becker in Stockton, California. And we learn a lot more about, as of right now, as of this time period that we're in right now, how does it actually influence people? If we didn't think that the past research was relevant, which I think it still is, we're going to get, in fact, even more information about how it influences people's behavior today. But that doesn't speak to the macro effects, just to be clear. Those experiments tell us more about how it influences individuals who receive it, but it wouldn't really speak to like the economy, because those are still small experiments and it's not really going to do anything to business income, anything of significance. It's just a few thousand people at best, receiving some extra income in those experiments that are currently being run in the US.
Okay, so I'm going to move to my next question. I have something related that related to this I want to come back to, but let me move to the next question. Because I made a list, and for those who don't, I made a list and I sent Professor Marinescu this list. So, and we talked about this before we went live. What do you think about the proposition that rapidly advancing technology will destroy jobs more quickly than new jobs can be created?
Right.
First of all, about the proposition itself, and then about that as a basis or reason for universal basic income.
Right. So first of all, let me say it is very unclear and it's hard to know what the future holds. And so if we look at past evidence, what has happened in the past is that usually new technologies have both created jobs and destroyed jobs, but on net, they tended to be beneficial for growth and sort of improved our standard of living, and on net created more jobs than they have destroyed. And so if you extrapolate that to the future, then you wouldn't be worried. However, we can never be sure that tomorrow is going to be the same as the past, and in particular because every new technology is in fact new and has its own characteristics. And if with artificial intelligence, a very great many tasks can be performed by these AIs, including there's some, for example, AIs writing journalism. They're not quite at the level of very good journalists, but they can, for example, summarize market trends in a pretty competent way.
Journalism is a very touchy subject in America right now.
Right, but like for example, they can summarize market trends in a more and more readable, engaging, competent way, just based on the data and sort of just scraping the web about what's going on. They can't interview people, but in terms of summarizing information in an understandable and engaging way, as an example, they can do that very well. So there's many applications like that could, I'm taking this because it's a rather high skilled job. So it's not just the low skilled jobs, potentially also higher skilled jobs that educated people do could be replaced by this. So then the question is, would this create enough new jobs, and what sorts of new jobs that would create? And at this point, I feel it's a little bit unclear, but again, I'm not a crystal ball reader to know maybe there will be more jobs. So personally, I am concerned that in the long run, this is a serious concern, but I don't think we're there yet. And I also want to be clear that in the past, technological revolutions on net have benefited workers and consumers. And this, every time it was doom and gloom, but in the end, we ended up well, and the technology, benefited us. But this doesn't mean we can feel confident that this time around it's also going to be all smooth sailing, and I'm personally concerned.
Okay, so
in the long
so you stole the thunder from what I was going to say.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I was going to say. Is to me, I look at the history of, and this is one of the things that got a lot of criticism. I did a video about universal basic income, and a lot of my audience criticized my what I was saying, and I want to be clear. I actually think that job destruction will be greater than most people think. I have a video, for people who are watching my channel, if you haven't seen it before, I have a video, 10 industries Tesla and Elon Musk will destroy, or something like that. If you just go on my channel and search for 10 industries, it's one of my biggest videos. And I think the destruction is going to be much more widespread than people think. Just an example, I don't know how much you know about me or how much you guys know about me. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. If self-driving cars become widespread, half of all criminal cases start with a traffic stop. There's no more drunk driving cases. There's no more driving while suspended cases. There's no more driving without insurance cases. There's no more, we stopped a car and we found drugs in the car. Like half, easily. The domestic violence cases keep going, but a large proportion of criminal cases go away. So it's not just the truck drivers who are affected, which Andrew Yang talks about truck drivers. It's like, and I'm a personal injury lawyer too. Self-driving cars have fewer accidents. We wipe out the personal injury, which would be a disaster. I know most of my viewers are going to be really upset at all the lawyer jobs that are lost. I know that's very upsetting for lots of people. We all cry for all the lawyers. And I'm mostly retired, so don't worry about me. And I know you're all worried about me. But so I think the insurance industry gets wiped out because there's no more accidents. The emergency rooms have fewer patients because there's no more accidents. The orthopedists, the chiropractors, and that's just like one slice of what happens. The rental car industry is destroyed. There's massive destruction. I think there's massive job destruction. But I also think that it frees up a lot of money, which this is what has always happened. What you mentioned before, there's massive, the horse industry was wiped out when the car came along.
Exactly.
But cars were more efficient, and it created a lot more free income for people to spend on other things. And I would say, this is, I guess, where my question is going to you. Every time I've seen this in history, it's created not only more jobs, but better jobs than existed before. I don't think there's an example of a new technology that was created that destroyed more jobs and didn't create new jobs. So can you think of an example from history where a new technology came along that destroyed more jobs than were created as a result? In a dynamic economy, I want to be clear. In a dynamic free market economy,
I don't know of an example of that. So, and that's exactly what I was saying before. I agree with you. The past experience is encouraging. In fact, I myself work on electrification, which was one of the biggest technological innovations in the US. And when rural areas in particular electrified, they lost a lot of farming jobs, but they gained a lot of manufacturing jobs, is what we find in our paper, as an example. Because with electricity, they could have bigger, more effective factories. And so that, actually created jobs. And so, again, the past is very encouraging, but I do think that there is something threatening about this new technology, because it seems to be able to potentially replace a lot more jobs than other technologies before. And again, I'm not quite sure what people would be doing, but it might just be my lack of imagination. So as such, I'd say that at least we can have a huge cone of uncertainty. Perhaps we can at least agree that it is.
I live in Florida, so
really uncertain.
Like, it's really clear. I live in Florida, and the cone of uncertainty in Florida is hurricane. So
yeah, there's that too.
So on that point, what I said in my video and what I'll say now is I agree with you. It's hard to imagine the jobs that will be created. So I like to think I'm an early adopter. I'm a futurist to some extent. And if you go back 20 years, I think 20 years is about the right number. I was not aware that there would be careers in search engine optimization. I was not aware there would be careers in social media marketing. I was not aware that there would be literally, for people who don't know, I'm making a significant amount of money as a YouTuber. It's not as much as I made as a lawyer in my past, but I'm actually making, and if you go to Solving the Money, there's a channel called Solving the Money Problem. He just did a video where he talked about how much money he's making on YouTube, and it's outrageous. I think he made $40,000 in 1 month. So I'm not making anywhere near that, just to reassure everybody, but there are a lot of people making a lot of money in jobs that we didn't imagine would exist. And the fact that we can't imagine the next series of jobs that will be created by this revolution doesn't mean they won't be created.
I agree, but we don't know. So back to the cone of uncertainty. So it's just like right now, it's something that I'm personally worried about because I can't imagine it, but it might just be my failure of imagination for the same reason that you were saying that we didn't imagine all these YouTubers and search engine optimizers before. So who knows? But I do think that this time might be different and that there is a more serious concern about jobs. And then where does UBI, to circle back to our topic, come into that? Well, then we'd be, if we had a UBI, I suppose we'd be prepared for people to, no matter what, as they potentially bump from gig job to gig jobs to the new jobs, we don't know how stable they will be and so on. No matter what, they have a minimum, cushion of income to rely on. And so in that sense, it might be a nice thing to have, but I don't think necessarily it's an argument for today. Right now, let's rush for basic income because today, a lot of jobs are clearly destroyed by this technology. But it would be more along the lines of preparedness, we talked about climate and Florida. Like maybe there isn't yet a mega event today, but maybe we want to put in place some, structure so that should it happen, we'd be ready to respond.
Yes, and actually, for people who don't know, Florida does a lot to prepare for hurricanes. They've been upgrading our we mentioned electrification. Florida Power and Light has done a lot to upgrade the electrical grid so they know where an outage happens quicker and it's isolated to fewer homes. There's all kinds of, but anyway, that's going off topic. So on this point about job creation, so my view is the reason, and you can correct me if I'm wrong or if you think I'm wrong, the reason that we have such great job creation when we have technology changing things is because we have a dynamic economy. That when you have a dynamic free market economy, it's easier for jobs to be created. It's easier for the capital to flow to where the opportunities are. So like right now, I'm making money on this YouTube channel. I invested in these headphones. I invested in computer equipment. I invested in this microphone that unfortunately is not working for this particular interview, but I'll figure it out. I have lights here. There's a light here. I've got lighting here. So I'm making investment decisions based on what I see as a dynamic free market economy. And one of the dangers that I see to job creation is not, we won't have benevolent politicians who know what jobs to create for us, but rather we will have seemingly benevolent politicians who cripple the dynamic free market economy and make it impossible for jobs to be created because the capital doesn't know where to go to create jobs. Because the market signaling is all screwed up by the intrusion on the free market economy. And one of the intrusions on the free market economy is universal basic income because it has to be funded. So just the question I would start with there, so just to give you a background of where I'm going here is, what what are things in the economy that do impair free markets signaling, affecting investment decisions and affecting job creation, just sort of as a general sense, and then we'll come to UBI's role in that after.
Well, one of them is a lack of competition. So, if you have various ways in which incumbent firms are dominant and potentially use strategies that are some are legal, some are questionably illegal to keep away competitors, that's one of the ways in which the market, fails to play its role in terms of delivering, maximum innovation to everybody at the lowest possible price, as well as something I've been working on, delivering good pay for workers, because there's also that side. If businesses don't compete for workers, in a totally free market, but instead are making these arrangements like has been done in the Silicon Valley, hey, don't hire my people and that I don't hire your people, that also hurts workers.
Wait,
one of the
factors... Are you referring to non-compete clauses, or are you referring to oligopoly?
No, this is no poaching agreements. So what I'm talking about in the Silicon Valley is between companies, exactly. And that's illegal, but it does
just
happen.
So people understand this, because I think I saw you speaking about non-compete agreements. So
I have
so
also,
I think I want to separate out the two different things that one came into my head, and one I think you were actually talking about, which is you have a job with a company and you sign a contract with a company, and the contract says for 2 years after you leave this job, you can't take a job with a competitor, which is known as a non-compete agreement. And those are, I think, iffy under legal. I think, like I said, 2 years specifically, because I think if they go longer than 2 years, the courts have said they're too long. There's all kinds of issues. I think some states regulate them more. And then the other one is something that you just mentioned, I wasn't aware existed, was agreements between companies basically forming sort of oligopoly practices where they...
Not to hire each other's employees.
Okay, so that's an example. I guess I would say, isn't another example of difficulty in labor. Like Elon Musk just meant, because people watching this channel are often Elon Musk fans. And Elon Musk was talking about hiring for Tesla's new factory in Germany, at Giga Berlin. And he said that there's something called garden employees, that if somebody leaves a company, they have to spend 6 months in the garden. They're not working, but they can't take another job. And it's like a government regulation that prohibits free movement of labor. That, really the goal there would be free movement of labor. And I think when we're talking about creation of new jobs, I think they're often not with new companies. They're not with competing companies. They're with a totally different industry that nobody saw coming. So,
but that could be as well. But you were just asking me what's a factor that inhibits the good functioning of the free market, and I was telling you a lack of competition, which both increases prices for consumers and lowers wages for workers.
So I'm going to refer to I don't remember the name of the economist or who wrote about this, but one theory from political science, at least, and maybe about economics, is regulatory capture. And I'm trying to remember who came up with this concept. That when you have strong regulation, the biggest players in the market tend to capture the regulator. So
exactly.
So my extension of that is big government tends to favor big companies over small companies. Big government tends to favor, and I think Tesla fans see that government has tended in some cases to favor oil companies over Tesla, and the media has tended to favor existing car companies over Tesla. There's a lot of criticism in the Tesla community about media, criticizing Tesla unfairly. You'll see stories about a Tesla and a Tesla car fire, or how often do you see a Ford in a crash? Right, Ford car crashes. But anytime a Tesla car, if there's ever a Tesla car involved in any incident, it's reported widely. There was a car fire in my neighborhood with a BMW and a Mercedes, no Tesla in the garage. I don't know which of the two vehicles started the fire, but there was no national news coverage about German cars burning down a house. Right, it literally destroyed the house.
So, but I think.
Sorry.
What you're trying to say here is that the lack of competition is sometimes the fault of the government, and I would agree that sometimes that is the case, and this regulatory capture does happen, like when also sometimes, former lobbyists or employees of some companies working on certain regulatory boards, all that stuff, it does happen. So we have to keep our eyes open for those sorts of problems. It's just that, government is both the problem and the solution. And,
that's where we disagree, but okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's how I see it. My point of view is that, we are working on policies that hopefully fulfill some goals, and we're looking at which one is most efficient, and that also involves like procedures and how we're going to go about avoiding certain potential downsides like regulatory capture and so on and so forth. But generally things aren't going to be perfect. But hey, if we think about it, they're not perfect in the private market either. Like, have you ever heard of accounting problems at Enron? Or
Sure.
Again, not to say that the market can't often do a great job, but I'm saying, institutional issues, problems, all that, it's human. It's
Sure,
human behavior in organizations. So
so
it's not a decisive argument in my view. It's more about, this is something we should pay attention to and see, how we structure things to limit those sorts of problems.
yeah, I don't think Enron's a great example because Enron operated in a highly regulated industry and had SEC. I think what's his name, Bernie Madoff, is another example of this. Bernie Madoff. I'm in Palm Beach County, Florida, which is where Bernie Madoff ruined the most people before I got here. But and
Right.
in both cases, they were powerful entities who were able to engage in regulatory capture to protect themselves from regulatory scrutiny. So I think those are actually examples where government actually impeded. I think there was even a renegade investor who was criticizing Enron and calling out, and people who are criticizing Madoff, and the government sort of whitewashed those criticisms. So, but I think there's this general question that I was trying to get at, which is, it's my opinion, and you may disagree with me, that with smaller government, you tend to have a more dynamic, freer market economy. That in theory, good government would protect markets and ensure freer markets and more dynamic economics. But in practice, in my experience and what I see, and this is bipartisan for me, this is Republican and Democrat, and probably whatever parties are in European countries and Canada too. I'm not educated enough to know, other than the LDP in Japan, if they still exist, that in general, government tends not to favor dynamic free market economies. But again, for some of my followers are SpaceX fans. There's a senator from Alabama who is always trying to protect his industry in Alabama. So he has been very, very vigorous opposing SpaceX getting contracts from NASA and SpaceX getting defense industry launch contracts, military launch contracts, because he wants to protect his base, which is the United Launch Alliance or whatever. So that's what I see is government very rarely seeks to protect dynamic market economics and more often seeks to protect established incumbents, and smaller government is better at it. So do you have a take on that? It's a big question, but do you have a take on that?
Yeah, it's a big question, and it's hard to I think we could say something if we narrow it down a little bit, but let's say that some European countries with big governments like Sweden or Germany have been at the forefront of technological innovation as well, certainly in some industries, and relative to the size of their population, they're very tiny. So their technological contributions can be significant given the size. So I don't think that it's a given that big government means bad government, but it could be, again, it depends. So I think for me, I see it as, what do you want from your government? Define some goals, and there we can disagree. Like I was saying earlier about the amount, that's sort of a political, like, how much do you think you want? And then let's figure out what's the best way to put that into place that will hopefully limit some of the issues around government capture or additional disincentives that are being created and so on and so forth. And that's the whole work of economists who are doing policy like myself, is to try to do work that will speak to both the benefits and the pitfalls of specific policies so that governments can make a more informed decision. But in the end, it's still very political because it's about what's the priority ultimately. Like, do you care enough that everybody should get X amount of money? Is that a high order priority for you? Or you're thinking, and that's a point of view, oh, if that's going to increase taxes, I don't want a bigger government. So then that's a bigger priority for me. So I don't want this. It's just a different, point of view that is a reasonable point of view if you have different priorities as far as what you're trying to achieve. So it's not something that can be decided by like science. What we can say from economics is just document, again, some of the costs, some of the benefits, some of the pitfalls of different policies, so that if we want to do this policy, we can figure out a better rather than a worse way to do it, in practice.
Okay, so we were sort of touching on job creation. I think we were talking about job creation. And so one of the questions I have for you is, does UBI itself, Universal Basic Income itself, does it tend to create jobs?
So I would say yes, and that's based on our work in Alaska, and also more importantly, it speaks to it even more directly, the work that they've done in Africa in villages where they installed basic income. There was additional job creation. And we think that the reason is for the same reason that during a crisis we often do additional support for the economy, so the government is sending extra money through various means, and that tends to create a little more jobs so that the economy doesn't tank so much. So that's sort of like what we call aggregate demand or stimulus, right? So when we put in more cash, people spend it. They spend it at their local retail, not only local, but among other, their retail businesses, their restaurants, and so on, and that creates jobs. So I think that it can create jobs to that channel. Now, it also can increase taxes, and that can potentially, depending on a bunch of parameters, also destroy some jobs. So again, we're back into what happens on net, given that the demand channel is a positive thing, is gonna mean that more people spending more jobs. But yes, we also have to find a source of revenue for that. And depending on what it is and so on, this could potentially, on that side, destroy some jobs. And then the question is how those two sort of channels balance each other out. And my prediction would be it probably would create some jobs a bit, but I wouldn't necessarily expect like a huge effect, because I think, there's this compensating mechanisms, and that's more speculation on my part, because as we were saying earlier, nothing on that scale has been tried. Sure. So it's hard to say for sure.
Well, when you say that there were research, there were experiments, or there were
right.
and are experiments, do those experiments include funding the UBI by taxing people in the same community?
No, and that's why we don't know what the effect is going to be for sure, because the current experiments are sending money from elsewhere. So all you see is the effect on people receiving it, which is quite positive and often creates jobs. But, you have to take into account the tax side and sort of look at the net effect.
Okay, so let me move on. So a big question. Or actually, I want to touch on that one more time, though. So if we're talking about a scenario where artificial intelligence is taking all the jobs, or taking the low-level jobs, the argument I heard, which was disjointed, was, this is from Andrew Yang, that artificial intelligence is taking all the jobs, so we're going to use UBI, and UBI creates jobs. It's like, well, if UBI is creating jobs, isn't it just creating jobs for the AI? Why would we think the UBI created jobs are going to be served by people instead of by artificial intelligence?
Right.
That's sort of a point that frustrated me when I heard Andrew Yang talking about it. Maybe there's no answer to that question, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, it's unclear, right? I mean, I agree with you that if we really think that this AI is so good, it's not clear that the additional demand from UBI would necessarily create jobs. But certainly, you can imagine that people having, a sufficient minimum amount of something to live on would potentially, encourage them to try out new things. And in that way, it could actually help us figure out what jobs are possible. But it's really not clear that the UBI, as far as it's not going to necessarily compensate the lost jobs by creating more jobs. But the way I see it is more as insurance. If in fact we're going to struggle to have enough jobs for everybody, and maybe there might be, again, I can imagine some more like gig jobs, sort of more like I'm an artist or something, and people value my performance, stuff like that. But that's not necessarily going to make a lot of income. So the UBI serves as a floor to make sure that no matter what, and again, we don't know, there's a lot of uncertainty, just in case something like that would happen, people would have something to go on and then figure it out in terms of will they find a job. But I don't think realistically it's going to compensate.
Okay.
If in fact this AI apocalypse, quote unquote, is coming, and it could be a good thing, by the way. depending on how we manage it, on the policies.
It'll be a good apocalypse.
Yeah, exactly. But in terms of destroying jobs, an apocalypse in terms of destroying jobs, not necessarily in making us worse off, then I'm not sure how UBI will solve that problem of the job destruction. But it's more about the problem of people's lives, that we are able to still have everybody have a floor that they can fall back on and kind of muddle through and figure it out. And again, I don't think that this is necessarily a negative. Even if all jobs are destroyed, it might be great for us, but we have to figure out how, like in terms of the policy and how we organize ourselves in that world. And it's so different from what we have today that we're going to have a lot of failure of imagination, in terms of figuring out how that will work.
So I want to bring up something else from my video and my rudimentary education in economics, if we're going to call it that. One theory that a lot of people advance is AI gets better at everything and there's no jobs left for humans. My view from economics is something called the Law of Comparative Advantage, which is not traditionally used in this topic. It's traditionally used in the topic of country versus country.
Right.
I think it's Michael Porter has this theory of competitive advantage, which has no sound economic basis from what I recall, but it's like a popular thing in business circles and political circles, is if the United States is better at producing everything. We're literally better at producing everything than, let's say, Mexico. I'm using Mexico as an example. I'm not saying it's true. Right. I'm just trying to use country A, country B, so we'll use the United States and Mexico. If the United States is better at producing everything, then the simplistic theory is, well, Mexico produces nothing, we produce everything, and Mexico, I guess, starves to death or lives off our generosity. But the Law of Comparative Advantage just says, no, we figure out where Mexico is relatively good at producing things.
Right.
Even though we're 10 times better at thing A and we're 5 times better at thing B, well, then the Mexicans produce thing B. And we produce more of thing A, and we produce more collectively that way than if Mexico produces nothing. And you can apply the same thing to AI. AI is 1,000 times better at us than driving cars. But AI is only twice as good at us at journalism. So maybe we go ahead and keep producing journalism, and AI spends more of its resources producing cars, to be overly simplistic. Right. And then there's more goods produced. There's no point at which it makes sense for humans to produce nothing. There's always something that we can contribute. And the idea that we have, I just wanted to know your take on, because you probably know more about the Law of Comparative Advantage than I do, especially since you've got a great international background. What do you think about that approach to
Right, exactly. So that's one of the ways that people like David Autor. So if you're interested in this whole technology thing, you should really check out his work at MIT. Has worked on that, and it's really about, indeed, do humans have some things that they're relatively better at and they can specialize in, and I think that it's just hard to predict, and especially how marketable these things are. Not only, maybe you can do something, but is there really going to be a demand that, for example, also brings in a living wage, issues like that. And that's where basic income can, again, act as a form of insurance, because if the things we are still very good at relative to the AI somehow don't generate a truckload of income, again, the UBI just serves as an insurance against that state of the world. But frankly, we just don't know. Okay. It's very hard to know for sure which way this whole thing is going to go in 100 years.
Okay, so I want to move on. One of the things that Andrew Yang, I use Andrew Yang because he's the leading proponent for UBI in America. Right. So one of the things that Andrew Yang said early, when he did an interview with Joe Rogan, which is what I focused on, and he said, and Joe Rogan said, well, how much is this going to cost? And Andrew Yang explained why it wasn't going to cost as much as people thought. And one of the things he said then that he's changed is, if you're currently getting benefits from the government, so you're getting Social Security, you're getting, food stamps, whatever, if your benefits add up to more than the universal basic income, then you don't get universal basic income. And if your benefits are, let's say, half, let's say it's $1,000 as the universal basic income, and you're getting some sort of benefit programs up to $500 a month, then you only get $500 in the universal basic income and you get your benefits. And I think he figured out that seniors vote. And when he figured out that seniors vote, all of a sudden, my mother gets $1,800 a month roughly from Social Security. So, and and I thought it was odd when we had the COVID cash. I forget what they called the big COVID relief thing.
The stimulus check.
My mother's income was not affected by the COVID shutdown, by all this economic problems, but my mother still got a stimulus check, and the reason is because seniors vote. So, what in your eyes and your understanding of what universal basic income is supposed to be from sort of an economics theoretical perspective first, who should get UBI? How should it work with people who are getting other benefits? Do we just shut down the other programs? How does that work?
So, yeah, so that's, so first of all, in order to pay for a UBI, we have to have a combination of increased revenue and or a cut in other benefits that's going to liberate funds for the government to pay the UBI. And so then the question is, and that's where, more progressive supporters of UBI often differ from more conservative supporters of UBI within supporters. So the more conservative supporters tend to say, let's cut as many of the programs that already exist as possible. Maybe not all of them, but the more we cut, the better, and just have the UBI and be done. This way, it also will cost less on net because you can take that revenue and reorient it to a UBI. The progressives tend to say, let's, on the contrary, keep as much as possible, maybe not everything, and add the UBI on top. And I think, one of the key problems with that is that there's a trade-off between how much is going to cost additional, the additional need to raise funds, and the impacts on inequality. Because, the problem is, certainly for the types of smaller UBIs that, have been talked about, usually, if you look at it, in many cases, certainly in Europe, people would be getting less in UBI than they got in benefits. So from a sort of inequality perspective, and especially if you're a progressive, that's terrible. Trying to help people, and then they get less benefits than before. So that's a serious issue right there. And again, if you're more of a free marketer pro UBI, you're whatever. Good, fewer benefits, simpler, it's all great. But if you're more into, hey, let's do something for poor people, we don't want them to be worse off, than before. So that's a very kind of serious type of problem. I think, we can think of some sort of middle ground where, you could take off some smaller programs, maybe not the big ones, and start with a small UBI so that you don't need to all of a sudden spend some crazy amount, and perhaps try something a little more incremental. That would be one way to go. So then by cutting a little bit potentially in some corner and raising a tiny bit extra revenue, you can see where you go. And one way to do that, by the way, I just want to mention is, and I'm sure, Tesla is all for that, is through a carbon tax. So tax carbon, it's a great idea anyways from an economics perspective. And then we can get back, it's called the carbon tax and dividend. We get back the money on a per capita basis, no strings attached. It depending on how high the tax on carbon is, at typical tax rate people are talking about, it's not a lot of money. But, it's something.
Tesla's going to eliminate that revenue because we're going to destroy the entire car and oil industry by making better. In 20 years, there won't be any carbon to tax.
Right, but that's one example, and a broader example in the same vein would be taxing environmental damage, and there's always some that occurs as we produce. So, and it's arguably, this is from economics the concept of externality, that we don't necessarily adequately price in the way that we, reduce resources for the future, not just carbon, but other ways. And that once we price that in, it produces the right incentives to preserve, resources for the future. And that there's always going to be some use of resources, like materials to make batteries, whatever it is. Some of that stuff is non-renewable, and you got to pay attention how you use it. Right now, there's not really an incentive to be careful with that. So you could, make it a broader tax on pollution and non-renewable resources and stuff like that. And so, yeah, sure, we should eliminate carbon. That's a high priority right now, but there's other things we can do. That's just one example of something we could think
I'm not
about.
saying whether we should or shouldn't eliminate carbon. I'm saying Tesla is going to eliminate carbon, whether or not we should.
All right.
So
I hope you're right.
Well, you know, if all the vehicles on the road are electric vehicles, and if all the electricity is coming from solar, then there's not much left for carbon.
Right. So, but in the short run, one of the biggest concerns, and I've been following that because I have a paper on the carbon tax, is precisely the transition for vehicles. It's still quite expensive, and so in the short run, there's a concern that it's not fast enough. That we can pretty easily at this point convert electricity to mostly, you know, carbon-free, net zero, but it's much harder to get that, you know, for transportation. And so, you know, I haven't followed that very closely, but that's what I'm hearing, that, you know, doing that fast enough is a little bit challenging.
Okay, I think you should pay, if you paid more attention to the Tesla community, you'd know that we think, first of all, it's already less expensive to own a Tesla Model 3 than it is to own a Toyota Camry over 5-year total cost of ownership. And it's getting less and less expensive. This is going to happen. This is one of those exponential curve things that we like to talk. Sorry, exponential curve things that we like to talk about. I'm not really good at doing this on camera. So, I was asking you what groups would get UBI and sort of talking about the programs, and I think sort of related to that. But before I get to what programs would be eliminated, I think we kind of touched on that. We have, I think, 340 million people in America. Some of the people who are here are, let's say, undocumented aliens, undocumented immigrants, or illegal aliens, depending on your political bias. Would undocumented immigrants... Actually, sorry, before I get to that, I feel like I didn't get the answer I wanted from a clear answer from the question I was asking you, which is, you sort of talked about conservative views of universal basic income would work this way and we would eliminate everything and this would be the amount, and progressive views would be like, no, we keep all the programs and we give them universal basic income. But is there from an economist perspective, is there a pure, this is what a pure universal basic income program would be, or is there no such thing?
No, there's no such thing.
Okay.
It's just like when you're asking me about the amount. Well, how much should it be? Well, how much do you want it to be? And then we can figure out some of the costs and benefits of your choices.
Okay, so it's not like, because, you know, Milton Friedman had a negative income tax, right? That was his...
Right, which is, by the way, that's a UBI.
It's close to a UBI. It's not exactly...
It is a UBI, but it specifies at the same time how you're going to pay for it, which most UBI proposals are not intrinsically doing. They just say, let's give everybody money without saying how we're going to pay for it.
Right.
The negative income tax is a UBI that also names its price tag in terms of, okay, and there's going to be this tax schedule that's going to pay for that. Because in the negative income tax, the so-called income guarantee or demo grant, that's exactly the UBI. Everybody's getting that. Yeah. And then the more you make and the more you pay with a certain, you know, profile of the tax rate.
Yeah, I think. Okay, I don't want to get into whether I don't think it's quite a universal basic income. I agree that it's close. So, what about undocumented immigrants? What about somebody who's here as you're from Romania, you lived in Paris, and now you're here in Pennsylvania? What about, and I'm sure you have students like this, somebody who came from Romania or France or whatever and is living in the United States as a student? Do people on student visas get it? How is it determined? I mean, maybe it's just political and that's a simple answer, but how is it decided who gets it? Right.
So it's political, but, you know, interesting. So in Alaska, for example.
Hold on one second. Hold on one second. You're breaking up.